Hello there, I hope you're doing well. Welcome back to the web development series in which you're going to learn how to build websites from scratch. So far we've covered topics on HTML and a basic introduction to CSS. And in this video we will go over the box model concept in CSS. This concept is very important to understand if you're a beginner at CSS, because if you don't understand this concept well, you might have trouble writing CSS, in the sense that you might write some CSS code and it will not work just because you don't have a clear understanding of the box model. So we'll have a look at what it is and how we can use it, or how we usually use it in writing websites. So for this video, I've created a new folder called Box Model, and I have an index.html file which has the same code we've written for the CSS intro practice for the last video, and it has the same CSS code as well. So if you run this, you're going to see something like this, which we covered in our last video of how we can build something like this. Now, to understand the box model, we will try to inspect this page. So if you right click on this page and click on inspect, you can see under the styles heading there's a box that is drawn for you. Now any element in HTML, so any element that you write in HTML has a corresponding box model for it in CSS. Now what does that mean? So for example, if I hover over any of these elements, you can see that a box is highlighted. So this is known as the box model. So any element, right now we have different elements on this HTML page. We have a heading, which is H1. You can see it in the card that is being shown. It says this is H1, this is paragraph, this is paragraph, this is H2, this is paragraph, this is H3, and this is paragraph. So all of these are elements, correct? So for all of them, there's this box model that is associated to these elements. Now, for instance, let's click on the H1 element. Now, as soon as I clicked on the H1 element, you can see there's still a box on the right side, and it has 5 different properties. So it's important to know that a box model has 5 properties. The first one is margin. This is the margin. The second one is border. The third one is padding. And the fourth and the fifth one are not written in words here, but they're the height and the width, or the width and the height. So the first number here represents the width. In this case, it's 977. And the second number represents the height, which is 37. Every element that you write in HTML has all of these 5 properties associated to their box model. Now you can change these values in CSS to have better design, correct? But in order to do that, you need to know what each of these values or what each of these properties do, okay? So that is what we will look at today, what each of these properties allow you to do and how you can manipulate them for each of the elements in your HTML. So I think the easiest one to start with is the height and the width. By default, since H1 is a block element, and if you don't know what is a block element, we've discussed this in our first video for HTML elements. A block element is an element that's going to take up the whole space, the whole width of your screen. So for example, if I change the screen size here, you can notice the width of this element also changes accordingly. So right now, the H1 element, for example, let's start with H1 element. Right now, the H1 element has a width of 978 pixels. I can change that through CSS. I can say, go to H1 element and change the width to, let's say, 200 pixels. I save that and we go back. Now you can see the width is just 200 pixels and the height is 74 pixels. I can even change the height by saying height should be also 200 pixels. And if we go back, you can see now the height is also 200 pixels. So the height and the width property are for the content. So for example, here we have the content or the text CSS introduction. The height and the width for that text is actually the height and the width for the box model. So just to make it a little bit clear, the width and the height of a box model are actually for the content of that element. Okay, so that is height and width. Now let's talk about border. So for instance, I can say make the border 10 pixels, make it solid, so it's a solid line, and let's give it red color. So if we go back, you can see now there's a border. And here on the box model on the right side, you can see the border has value 10, 10, 10, 10. So top, left, right, bottom, all the sides have the same thickness for the border, which is 10 pixels. So that is border. I think border is very simple to understand because you can see it right now. So that's border. Now you can also have something called background color, which I think we discussed it before. So in this case, let's give it a color of aqua. And you can see that the color, the background color that you give to any element only exists within the border. So even though outside of the border you have something called margin, that area doesn't take the background color. The background color is always contained within the border. So that's very important to know. So now we covered height, width, border, and we looked at the background color as well. Now let's talk about padding. So for instance, if I write padding should be, let's say 50 pixels, and we go back, you can see there is some spacing around the text, between the text and the border. So between the text CSS introduction and the border itself, you can see that there is some spacing. That spacing is the padding. So if I highlight it here, you can see there's a padding of 50 pixels on the left, bottom, right, and top of that element. So that is padding. So padding is the spacing between the border and the content. The content is this part and the border is this part. So the spacing between the border and the content is called padding. Now, if you have a background color, like you can see right now, there's a background color. If there's a background color, the spacing will take that background color because padding is between the border, like within the border, right? So it's not outside of the border. So that is padding. But there are different ways of adding the padding to any element. For example, right now I've written it as padding in 50 pixels. That means add a padding of add a spacing of 50 pixels on all four sides of this element. But I can even say that just add padding to the left side, 50 pixels. And if we go back, you can see there's now spacing only on the left side. And here also you can see there's padding of 50 pixels only on the left side. All the other remaining three sides are without any padding. So that's one way. And you can do the same for other sections as well. So for example, I can say padding top should be 20 pixels. Padding right should be 30 pixels, and padding bottom should be 40 pixels. Now you will use these individual properties only when you have different values. If you have the same value for each of them, then it's pointless to write padding left, padding top, padding right, padding bottom. It's pointless. You can just write padding and then give it a value. But if there are different values, in that case, you can use these separate properties. So if you now check, there's a padding of 50 on the left. There's a padding of 20 on the top, 40 on the bottom, 30 on the right side. If I want to add padding for a specific side, for instance, I just want the padding for the left side, I can specify a property called padding left, which will just add this much padding to the left side of the element. So if we go back, you can see there's a spacing on the left side, but there is no spacing on the right side. And the bottom, there is spacing, but it's coming from the height. So if I get rid of the height, you'll see that there is no padding at the bottom as well. The only padding that there is for the left side. Similarly, you can add padding for the other sides as well. So for example, for top, I can say 20 pixels. For bottom, we can say 10 pixels. For right, we can say 40 pixels. So now there's a value for each side, left, top, bottom, right, and all of them are different values basically. So if you go back, you can notice in the padding, in the box model, the padding section has 20 for top, 40 for right, 10 for bottom, and 50 for left. So that's one way of specifying different values for different sides. Usually, we don't use this approach. If you want to apply different values for padding for different sides, what you can do is just use the padding property and specify the different sides. For instance, there is a different value for each side. There's 50 for left, 20 for top, 10 for bottom, 40 for right. I can specify these values in a certain order that padding understands, which is this order. Top is first, right is next, bottom is next, and then the last one is left. And if you look at the box model, it's kind of a clockwise direction. So it starts at top, goes to right, goes to bottom, goes to left. So the first value that you specify should be for top, the second one should be for right, the third one should be for bottom, and the fourth one should be for the left side. So let's take this as an example. The top value that we want is 20 pixels. So I'm going to write 20 pixels. Then comes right. So the right value we specified was 40 pixels. So 40 pixels here. The bottom value we said was 10 pixels, and the left value was 50 pixels. In this way, you wouldn't need to write different properties. You can just mention all those values in the padding property, but the order must be the same. It should be clockwise order, and it should start at top and end at left. So if you go back, refresh, it's the same thing. You don't even need to refresh. It's the same values. Now, this is one way. So you can write padding this way as well. So one way is padding 50 pixels, which applies to, this applies to all sides. If you add 4 values, it's going to take each value for each side. And then there's another way. You can have 3 values only, and in that case it will take the first value as the top, the second value is left and right, and the third value for bottom. So it would look something like this. Padding is let's say 10 pixels top, 20 pixels left and right, 30 pixels bottom. And I'll just comment these out so you can see the difference. If we go back, you can see the left and the right side took 20, but the top and the bottom have different values from the first and the third value. 10 for the first one, which is here, 10 for the top, 20 and 24 left and right, and 30 for bottom. So that is padding. Padding is, like we said, the space between the border and the content, and you can specify it in multiple ways. Now, the one that's left is margin. Margin is basically the spacing between different elements. So the space between, let's say, this element and this element will be considered margin. But because these are different elements, they have their different margins, correct? So for instance, if I say margin 100 pixels, if we go back, you can see there is some spacing around the CSS introduction section, and that has 100 pixels of spacing outside of the border. Margin is also spacing, but it is outside of the border. So the spacing that is outside of the border is considered margin, and the spacing that is within the border and between the border and the content is considered padding. So you can think of margin as outer spacing and padding as inner spacing. That's the only difference. And we can specify it in the same way. You can either write margin with one value, that means it's going to have this value for all 4 sides, or you can have different margin properties. So margin top, let's say 10 pixels, margin bottom is 20 pixels, let's say 30 pixels, margin left is 40 pixels, and margin right is 20 pixels. So for each of them, we're specifying a different margin. So if you notice here, there is 10, 20, 30, and then 40 on the side. And you can specify the same thing as with the top, right, bottom, left order. So it would be 10 pixels for top, 20 for right, 30 for bottom, 40 for left. We can get rid of all of these and it will have the same effect. And then finally, you can even specify just 3 values. So for example, if I remove this one value, it's going to take 20 pixels for both left and right side. So once you understand the order, it's easy to remember it. We usually use either all sides, or if you want to specify different sides, we use one with each side. If you remember from the first lesson, we spoke about block elements and inline elements. So we said some elements are block elements and some elements are inline elements in HTML. A block element is an element that is going to take the full width of the screen size available, and an inline element is only going to take the width that it requires. Now there's a property called display that I'm going to talk about, but before that, let me show you the default behavior here. So for instance, here for H1, we've specified the width, right, from in our CSS. Let's get rid of that. Now you can see this element is taking the full screen width that is available. This is because H1 is a block element. I can make it inline element through CSS. I can say, please make H1 behave like an inline element. In that case, it's only going to take the width that it has, that it requires to display the content. So if you notice here, the width and the height are now set to auto, and that's because we've made this element as an inline element. So how much ever space it requires in terms of content, that much length or width it's going to take. Width or height it's going to take, sorry. That is inline element. Now it has become an inline element. If I make paragraph as well inline element, so display inline, you will notice that they're now next to each other because inline elements don't start at new lines. So block elements, they start at new line and they take the full width of the screen. But inline element, they do not start on a new line. If there's space on the previous line, they will just start on that line. Just like here, the paragraph started just right next to the H1 element. And they don't take the whole width of the screen. They take only the size that they require. Now, if you have, before that, there's even another property that we have, which is called none. So if you use none, it will just it will just make the element disappear, or it will just hide the element. So there are some values of display. You can either make it as a block element as well. So now it will be displayed as a block element, or you can change it to inline, or you can have it as none. If you make it as a block element, so for example, if I go to HTML and I add span, which is by default an inline element, this is CSS intro. This is CSS intro. You can see it starts right next to the H1 element because H1 is now H1 is now an inline element. But if I change span to be a block element, it will start at the next line. Now there are a few things that you need to know about the box model for inline elements. So for instance, this span that I've written here is an inline element by default. I can add another span here to show you the difference, or actually between the paragraph would be much more sensible. Somewhere, I don't know. Let's put it here. Okay. Now you can see this is intro. This is intro is a span and it's being displayed as a block element. I will get rid of this for now just to show you the difference. Here is our span element. I can give it a color, background color, let's say background color aqua. So that's your inline element. This is CSS intro. Let's even give it a border of 10 pixels, solid red. So there is some border that is now given to, now there is some border that is there for us to see the element. I'll get rid of the other one just so it makes more sense. So this is the span that we're looking at. Now, the box model we said has 5 properties. We looked at border, so border is working. Height and width. For example, if I go back and I set the height for this to be 200 pixels and the width for this to be 200 pixels as well. And if we go back, nothing happens. That is because for inline elements, if you try to put height and width for an inline element, it does not take any effect. If it's a block element, it will have that inline, if it's a block element, it will take the height and the width. For example, for H1, the same height and width, let's put it here. It's going to take the same height and width that we specify, but for inline element, it's not. So inline elements don't take any height and width for their box model, but block elements do. That's number 1. Now, number 2, we have padding 50 pixels. If you go back, this is a little bit, I want it in the middle because let's get rid of this. Okay. Now you can see that there is some padding that is there. So for example, if I click on this element, you can see there's a padding of 50, 50, 50, 50 on all the four sides, correct? But you can also see that the text on the next line is kind of getting merged into this. So the padding doesn't work for the bottom, and if you get rid of the background color here as well, you will see that it doesn't work for the top as well. The padding doesn't work for the top and the bottom, but it does work for the left and the right, because you can see the spacing here, you can see the spacing here, but for the top and the bottom there is no spacing. So that means for inline elements, the padding only works for the left and the right side. You can even notice it here. Span has height and width 200 pixels, but it's grayed out because inline elements don't accept or don't have any effect in terms of height and width because they're auto. Padding only works for left and right. Border also only works for left and right. I mean, you can see the whole border, but it's getting merged with the text that's surrounding at the top and the bottom. And the same thing happens for margin. So if I say margin 50 pixels, you can see there is spacing on the left and the right, but at the top and the bottom, there is no spacing. So this is an important concept, and this is where I've noticed people struggle in the beginning, because they write some CSS code and they say it's not working. It's because some of the properties, if they're trying to assign it to an inline element, will not take any effect. So it's very important to know when these properties are going to take effect and when they are not going to take any effect. And once you know this, it's easier to build on top of that knowledge. So just remember, for a block element, all the box model properties work. For an inline element, the height and the width do not get applied. The padding and the margin and the border only work for the left and the right, as they should. For the top and the bottom, they get merged into the surrounding content. And then we also know that you can change the way an element behaves. You can make them, if it's a block element, you can change it to an inline element. If it's an inline element, you can change it to a block element using the display property. And I think that's about it for the box model. Very important, especially if you're a beginner. I hope this was clear. It's an important topic. If you need to learn more about this, you can obviously go to MDN Box Model and learn more about it. Obviously, there's so much to learn, and I can't cover everything in these videos, but they will definitely give you an introduction and a good starting point to learn further. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.